Hello, so today with us we have Robert Leach, who will be giving us a little bit of information, who will be providing this material, this recording on his most recent work, which I will be introducing in a second. But I would like to introduce the man first. So Robert Leach is a prize-winning poet, theatre director, and academic. He has been a reader in drama and theatre arts at the University of Birmingham and senior lecturer in English literature at Edinburgh University. Robert has acted professionally in Britain and in the USA and directed plays in Russia as well as in Britain. His production of I Want a Baby by Sergei Tretyakov in Moscow in 1990 was the Russian premiere of this 1920s play, which was banned in the communist Soviet Union for decades. Among Robert's writing about theatre, there are several books about theatre authored by Robert Leach, but one can find the following that I'm going to mention. So there's Theatre Studies, The Basics, Revolutionary Theatre, A History of Russian Theatre with Viktor Borovsky, Stanislavski, and Meyerhold, Russian Futurist Theatre, Theory and Practice, and the most recent book, Sergei Tretyakov, I Want a Baby and Other Plays, a collection which he edited and translated, and I understand that he's also going to speak to us about today. So, Robert?
Yes, I want to speak a little bit about Sergei Mikhailovich Tretyakov, who's a very influential figure in the development of modernism and modernist theatre in the 1920s and 1930s. In Russia, yes, but also beyond Russia. He was engaged with various well-known writers and scholars in the 1930s, especially in controversies and polemics with Georg Lukács, Ezra Pound, Gottfried Benn, and others. But his name has disappeared because he was done to death by Stalin's agents in the Great Terror in 1937. He was an early victim of that. As Brecht said, his name is condemned, his books are destroyed. And that was no less than the truth. For instance, when Victor Shklovsky's influential book about the Russian avant-garde of the 1920s was published in 1940, under the title Mayakovsky and His Circle, there is not a single mention of Tretyakov in that book. Yet, Tretyakov was one of Mayakovsky's very closest friends and collaborators for nearly 20 years. Before the First World War, Mayakovsky had something of an affair with Tretyakov's younger sister. And when he finally committed suicide in 1930, Mayakovsky I'm talking about now, Tretyakov was the leading pallbearer at his funeral and spoke first in the tributes to Mayakovsky at his funeral. So, as I say, for nearly 20 years, he was Mayakovsky's just about his closest collaborator and friend, and yet in that book, he's not mentioned at all. And not only I'm going to talk for a minute, in a minute about Tretyakov's theatre work, but I just want to make the point before that he was very, his interests and his work covered a huge range. He was a poet, he was a fiction writer, an essayist, a film scenarist, a journalist, a pioneer broadcaster, the first person to do an outside broadcast in Russia in the 1920s, broadcasting from Red Square about the revolutionary parades and so on. He was a cultural animateur and so on. So I just want to say that I'm only covering what is really a very small part of his creative life, actually. And that's the theatre work. First of all, he wrote 6 plays, 7 if you count 2 very different versions of probably his best play, I Want a Baby. And we managed to publish them last year in English translation. So I'm just going to hold that book up for you. I Want a Baby and Other Plays by Sergei Tretyakov, and that's now available. 6 plays, which I can easily quickly divide into 3 groups of 2. First of all, he began with adaptations, but such extreme adaptations that they become effectively new plays. First of all, one called The World Upside Down, which was adapted from a French play of before the First World War. It was written anyway by Marcel Martinet, about an agrarian revolution, but Tretyakov adapts it so that it echoes the Russian Revolution. This was directed by Meyerhold and was a great success in 1923. And almost at the same time, he was adapting a Russian classical comedy by Ostrovsky, which translates, or in his version is entitled "A Wise Man." It's a sort of clown show now, set among the white Russian anti-Bolshevik emigres in Paris. And this was directed, also extremely successfully, by the way, by Sergei Eisenstein, so the great film director. And he worked very closely with Eisenstein for a period of time, quite a long time. I mean, he wrote the captions to the battleship Potemkin, and he worked with Eisenstein on other films as well. But here first of all, he worked on A Wise Man. Then he worked on the next two plays with Eisenstein, which were what he called agit melodramas. They're pretty propagandistic, sharp, short plays. One called Are You Listening, Moscow? And the other called Gas Masks. I won't speak about them at the moment because I'll go on to the last two plays, which we would probably call epic plays. So he did two adaptations, he did two propagandistic plays, and then he did these two big epic plays, which are probably his best known works, one of which was called Raw China, which the Meyerhold Theatre did in 1926, and it stayed in their repertoire for nearly 10 years. And this focused on an incident in China, which involved a British gunboat threatening the Chinese people. And the play, incidentally, was performed all over the world. It's certainly the most performed of all the Russian revolutionary plays. It was performed not just in Europe, but in America, in India, in Japan. There was even a production of it by a group of Jewish actors in one of the concentration camps in Nazi Germany in 1940, which shows you something of the appeal of this play across the world and across peoples. And lastly, I Want a Baby, which was his final play, which Meyerhold desperately wanted to present, but never did present it for reasons of censorship and other problems with the Soviet authorities. This is the play, I Want a Baby, that's probably the most relevant to us today. It concerns a young woman worker who wants a baby but doesn't want a husband. So it's therefore about women's rights, especially a woman's right to control her own body and her own fertility and so on. In other words, I would say it's bang up to date as a play. And so that's a wide range of very interesting plays. And I just also want to mention, before I be quiet, Tretyakov's extremely important other practical work in the theatre, because he wasn't just a playwright, he was actively involved with the leading avant-garde Russian theatres of the 1920s, especially those of Meyerhold and Eisenstein. In the early 1920s, Meyerhold was engaged in, how should I put it, updating what he had originally called scenic movement, so that it became the much more Sovietized biomechanics. And as he progressed, he realized that he needed to take into account the fact that actors speak on the stage, so stage speech. And he worked with Tretyakov on precisely this. They ran a course together called Text Movement. And so Tretyakov was absolutely in at the evolution of biomechanics. And not only that, Meyerhold actually said that, I should just say, Tretyakov's aim, I want to quote this because it's interesting. He says he was to teach the actor worker not to converse and not to declaim, but to speak. That's an interesting series of distinctions there. So he was central to the creation of biomechanics, and as Meyerhold himself admitted, and I quote again, he more than anyone else helped in the evolution of biomechanics. Yet once again, we see he's been completely written out of the history of biomechanics. Nobody knows that he was more than anyone else, apart from Meyerhold himself, obviously, the key influence in that development. And secondly, I want to go on because Tretyakov also worked very closely with Eisenstein to develop what they called expressive acting. In brief, the expressive acting involves what they called organic movement, the idea that the whole body is engaged in every single movement. As Eisenstein said, if you balance a billiard cue on your nose, you don't just involve your nose, you involve the whole body. And Tretyakov was absolutely crucial in that. In fact, he and Eisenstein wrote an article together, a long piece called Expressive Acting, which explains what they were trying to do. The key to stage movement, they said, was to make an actor who had the skill of a ballet dancer, but the spontaneity of a sports player. But added on to the top of that was the idea that the movement should then be sold to the audience, by which a crude example of which would be the tightrope walker in the circus walks the tightrope. But no, they don't just walk the tightrope, they sell the walking of the tightrope to the audience. And so that was what they were looking for in their actors. So that even such a skimpy and brief outline of Tretyakov's work in the theatre suggests to me that he was a very significant influence on the development of 20th century theatre. And it's just more than a shame that his work has been lost or is little known, because it seems to me anyway, that it is so important. And we can understand when we think about what Tretyakov did, why his friend Bertolt Brecht referred to him in a moving poem written after Tretyakov, after he learned that Tretyakov had been killed. He called Tretyakov my teacher. And I think that sums up how significant he was for the development of 20th century theatre. I hope that gives you some brief idea of what Tretyakov was about, and I hope you will explore his work further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That, of course, help us in our efforts to contextualize Stanislavski within broader work, and to remember that, of course, Stanislavski, yes, was a key player in modernism, but was not the only player. So such a contextualization becomes very helpful. Thank you, Robert.
Okay.